Ladies and gentlemen, the decision taken by the British people in last year's referendum to leave the European Union brings with it many consequences, not the least of which is that in 2 years' time, the UK's international trade relations will no longer be determined by the common commercial policy of the European Union. As of 2019, Britain must set its own policy on international trade and investment. This is clearly a challenge for us as a country, when responsibility for our trade relations has been run through Brussels for so long. You only have to look at the urgent capacity building that's gone on over the past few months in Whitehall as the government seeks to reconstitute a national team of negotiators and trade policy experts for the many pressing talks ahead. In fact, they've even offered enough inducements to one of my own trade advisors to persuade her to join their department. So, Sarah, I look forward to being your boss again in 8 days' time. But for all the obvious challenges that face us over the coming years, this is also an opportunity to redefine Britain's place in the world. As a proudly internationalist party, it's an opportunity that we in the Labour Party relish. And I hope to present before you this afternoon what our vision of Britain as a global trading nation with a commitment to fair, free and open trade is, based on uncompromising standards, on high ambition and on shared prosperity for all. In a word, it's a new internationalism for the 21st century. Labour's been a champion of international trade from its earliest beginnings as a political movement. When Joseph Chamberlain and the Tariff Reform League were pressing for protectionist duties against US and German imports in the opening years of the 20th century, it was Keir Hardie and other leaders of the fledgling Labour Party that stood in defence of fair and open trade, both as a source of prosperity for working people and as a bulwark against the rising tide of imperial rivalries. After the First World War, it was Labour again that held the line against the Conservatives' introduction of tariffs during the 1920s and 30s as countries threw up protectionist barriers against one another in this beggar-thy-neighbour retreat into mercantilism that hastened the world tragically once more towards mutual destruction. And then, of course, it was the Labour government of Clement Attlee that reaffirmed its commitment to international commerce in the post-war years as well, crafting the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, which was to serve as the forum for multilateral negotiations until the birth of the World Trade Organization almost 50 years later. So Labour supports trade quite simply because of the enormous benefits it brings. Exports of goods and services account for 30% of the UK's economic output, and millions of jobs depend on our continuing access to overseas markets. Integration into global supply chains means that many more businesses are bound up with international trade than those in frontline exports alone. While 9% of small and medium-sized enterprises in this country are directly engaged in overseas trade, a further 15% are integrated into that supply chain of other export businesses, meaning that 1 in 4 of British SMEs are already involved directly or indirectly in trading overseas. And I was really pleased, Helen, that you focused so much in your opening remarks on SMEs, because given that SMEs are responsible for 60% of all private sector employment in this country, and that many more of them fall into the category of potential exporters, the importance of trade for people's jobs and livelihoods is absolutely clear to see. And again, let me pay tribute to the particular work that the ACCA has done to help SMEs gain access to the finance necessary to develop their export reach. Services exports are crucial to our balance of trade. Without the 90 billion surplus in services trade to offset our substantial goods trade deficit, the UK's current account would look very different from how it does today. The UK is the world's second largest exporter of services behind the USA, and that's a fact of which I am, and we all should, be very proud. When we look at the sectoral level, the global significance of Britain's financial services industry is well attested. Perhaps less well known is the important contribution that other business services make to our balance of trade. The UK's exports of professional, technical and other business services have doubled in value over the past decade to more than £70 billion, with the result that their net contribution to our balance of trade in services is actually a third of the total surplus. That's something we need to celebrate in the present, but more important, it's something that we need to support in the future. And within the professional services sector, let me pay particular tribute to accountancy, seeing that accountancy services exports from the UK currently run at more than double the imports that we buy into this country. The effort that the ACCA has put in to boost export growth is exemplary, and I salute the work that you've done personally, Helen. I know you've been a globe-trotting CEO to develop the industry's links with new and emerging markets right across the world. So, Britain's proud record as a trading nation is why Labour's General Election Manifesto, launched this month, includes a dedicated section on international trade with explicit commitments as to how we will support British exporters of goods and services alike. And I'll highlight just 5 of those commitments at this point, as I'll pick up on others in the rest of my speech. And the manifesto itself is, of course, freely available online for you all to read at your leisure. But let me just pick out these 5. First and foremost, the commitment to work with business to develop an integrated trade and industrial strategy, ensuring that our overseas exports and our inward investments support the high productivity, high wage, high skills economy that we aspire to, and vice versa. Second, the commitment to use the full range of export credit finance, insurance and trade promotion tools to boost British exports and to support those sectors that we identify as priorities in our industrial strategy. Third, the commitment to create a network of regional trade and investment champions up and down the country to ensure that the interests of businesses right across the UK are represented in our trade strategy, and to include regional representatives on our trade missions overseas. Fourth, the commitment to boost market access for British exports of environmental goods and services, both bilaterally and through our active support for an environmental goods agreement at the WTO. And fifth, the commitment to champion the export interests of small and medium-sized businesses by offering them a dedicated export incentive scheme and by ring-fencing grants from the Trade Show Access programme to help SMEs reach new customers around the world. In this last regard, we were disappointed that CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between the EU and Canada, despite stretching to 2,255 pages of text, did not manage to include a single commitment to the export interests of SMEs. Labour will ensure new trade agreements include a commitment to support the market access needs of all our small and medium-sized firms. Our long-standing belief in fair and open trade is reaffirmed in our manifesto commitment to the rules-based trading system of the WTO as the primary institution which underpins the workings of the global marketplace. From its role as one of the founding fathers of the GATT until today, Labour has always seen multilateralism as the best way of ensuring the benefits of trade are shared as broadly as possible, which is why we backed the WTO's Doha round at its outset as a means of addressing the new challenges facing the global trading system. Equally, we recognise that there will now be a need for the UK to negotiate its own trade agreements once we've left the EU, and Labour is committed to advancing negotiations towards a new generation of FTAs and investment treaties with all our key trading partners. First amongst these will be our new relationship with the European Union. EU member states still account for 44% of our total exports, and Labour is united with business, with trade unions, and most commentators in prioritising the best possible access to the single market once we've left the EU. So I think it's quite extraordinary to see Theresa May using the Conservative manifesto to reiterate the perverse claim that she is prepared to walk away from the EU without a deal, forcing our businesses to fall back on WTO rules and all the consequences that this would entail. We reject the idea that we can turn our back on the European Union without a trade deal in place. A Labour government will make it an absolute priority to secure continued tariff-free access to the European single market with no new non-tariff barriers for either goods or services. And given the dwindling time available in which to finalise a deal, we'll be fully prepared to negotiate those transitional arrangements so as to avoid any cliff edge for the UK economy. In the longer term, we recognise just how important it is for our access to the European market to ensure our regulatory framework is properly aligned to that of the EU, whether by means of mutual recognition agreements or other provisions that maintain equivalence of our standards and regulations into the future. To take one example, as part of our commitment to growing the digital economy, a Labour government will ensure that the UK continues to meet the adequacy requirements of the EU's General Data Protection Regulation so that the many service industries which rely on the secure cross-border transfer of data can continue doing business freely in EU member states. And when it comes to human capital, we've repeatedly been told by business how absolutely essential it is for their competitiveness in global markets to have continued access to the migrant labour force that sustains so many parts of our economy. Labour is committed to a fair and transparent control and management of immigration so that our economy can flourish, just as we are committed to ensuring that migrant workers are able to benefit fully from the contribution that they make with all the necessary protection under law. The Conservatives have stated that their Brexit priority is reducing immigration. We believe that the real priority is our economy and the jobs and the growth that depend on it. They would sacrifice growth to keep immigration low. We would manage immigration to reflect the needs of our economy. Any agreement that determines the future relationship between the UK and EU will be sui generis, in that it starts from this rather unique situation of two trading partners that currently share full harmonisation of regulations and standards within a single market. This is the first time that countries have begun to negotiate a trade agreement explicitly to increase the barriers between them. So it's clear we're doing this for political, not for trade reasons. That's fine. The British people have spoken in the referendum and we acknowledge that. But we have to understand that we are increasing barriers to trade between us. What we need to do is to ensure that that increase is kept to a minimum. For all other trade and investment agreements, a Labour government will seek to tackle tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, while at the same time protecting the ability of future governments to develop public policies in the interests of all. The Just Trading Initiative that I announced last year commits our party to working with trading partners around the world to develop best-in-class agreements that look precisely to this double objective: the minimisation of genuine trade barriers and the maximisation of high standards, regulations and rights. A Labour government will negotiate new trade agreements with our main trading partners, but unlike other parties, we're not prepared to damage some of our most cherished social and environmental protections and standards in the process. This weekend's paper contained the news that Theresa May and Donald Trump held a private meeting at the G7 summit in Sicily, specifically to reaffirm their commitment to a UK-US free trade deal. Now, you may recall the reaction of the US agribusiness lobby when the Prime Minister first announced the start of preliminary talks towards such an agreement during her visit to the newly elected president in Washington in January. The American Farm Bureau Federation wasted no time in confirming that it would be seeking the same so-called food hygiene changes in any UK-US deal that it was pursuing in negotiations towards the TTIP with the EU, namely an end to restrictions on US exports of chlorine-dipped chicken, carcinogenic homegrown beef, and genetically modified crops. In sharp contrast to that, a Labour government will not sacrifice our essential public health, food safety, or environmental protection standards in the way that Theresa May and the Conservatives appear to be prepared to do. Ordinary people across Europe had deep concerns about TTIP. Leaving aside the content of the deal, the manner in which the negotiations was conducted was quite extraordinary. I had my own personal experience of that secrecy when I became the first British MP to gain access to the long-awaited reading room that was eventually set up in Westminster to provide sight of the negotiating text. I was granted 90 minutes. I was deprived of my mobile phone or any other electronic device, and invited to sit alone in front of 500 pages of TTIP text, plus thousands of annex pages, and then only once I had signed a confidentiality agreement to guarantee that I would talk to no one afterwards about what I had seen.
So what did it say?
That was as the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. I was informed, without the slightest of irony, that I was being granted such access as a privilege, even though the TTIP negotiations by that time were in deep freeze and the whole exercise was pretty much redundant. What price open and accountable democratic debate and parliamentary scrutiny? That type of Kafkaesque secrecy has undermined public trust in global trade negotiations. And we need to do much better if we're going to restore that public trust. Entering into trade obligations is a serious undertaking, since those obligations are binding upon future administrations and can therefore represent an automatic restriction of their sovereign right to determine public policy in the interests of their electorate. To sign up future generations to such obligations in secret without due parliamentary scrutiny is, in my view, anti-democratic and wrong. When such action is taken against the express will of a parliamentary committee, as the Conservative government did when it agreed to the provisional application and conclusion of CETA last October, is, in my view, doubly wrong. That's why the Labour Party has committed to transparency and parliamentary scrutiny of trade and investment deals, rejecting the idea that the negotiation, the signing and ratifying of international treaties should be the exclusive preserve of government operating without the checks and balances of the democratic oversight that Parliament is there to provide. As stated in our manifesto, a Labour government will first set out our priorities in an international trade white paper in order to lead a national debate on the future of Britain's trade policy. I consider that commitment is right and proper when so much is at stake. And I'm only sorry that the current Secretary of State for International Trade, whom I have repeatedly challenged to produce his own white paper, has conspicuously failed to do so. Look, we in the Labour Party believe in open trade and openness about trade. But more than this, the new internationalism that I've spoken of is based on an ambition to see trade and investment support the highest standards of sustainable growth, of decent jobs and shared prosperity. Our drive to build industrial capacity and open up new markets for British exporters is one side of that ambition. The other is our commitment to uphold and enhance the rights and regulations that previous free trade agreements have too often put at risk. Labour will ensure that trade deals cannot undermine our ability to regulate in the public interest, whether on grounds of public health, food safety, environmental integrity, labour standards, or any other area of public policy. We will not allow our cherished rights and protections to be bargained away behind closed doors. A Labour government will guarantee the protection of public services from free trade agreements. EU officials have consistently included the sectors of health, education, rail, post, energy, water, sewerage in trade negotiations, claiming that it will still be possible to protect public services from external challenges, even while their own trade lawyers and others have cast doubt on those claims. Labour will ensure that full and comprehensive trade carve-outs exist so that there can be no doubt whatsoever that future governments will be able to manage and regulate our public services free from such constraints. A Labour government will work with other WTO members to end the unfair dumping of state-subsidised produce on our markets. The Conservatives consistently blocked EU efforts to respond to dumping with the higher duties needed to defend our steel industry. A Labour government will develop the full range of trade remedies necessary to support key jobs and sectors affected by those unfair practices, and the capacity to use those remedies effectively too. And we will integrate that with our industrial strategy. It makes no sense to have an industrial strategy that is divorced from your trade policy. These two must be coherent and go hand in hand. Our vision is internationalist. It extends beyond our own borders. The Labour Party manifesto guarantees the world's least developed countries continued access to the UK market on the same terms they've enjoyed to date as one of our national obligations under the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition, we will ensure that no other vulnerable countries lose essential export revenue in the wake of Brexit, such as Commonwealth countries that currently benefit from preferential access to the UK market to the value of some £600 million a year. Sound investment policies are important in ensuring that countries can profit from globalised capital flows. Too many of the poorest countries have failed to benefit as they should from foreign direct investment, while tax avoidance, and in that I include transfer pricing in intra-corporate trade, costs the countries of the Global South billions each year in much-needed government revenue. Most of the UK's bilateral investment treaties with these countries actually date back to the 1980s and 90s, hence our pledge to review all the UK's historic investment treaties and ensure that they are fit for purpose in the 21st century. Our commitment is to crack down on tax dodging and to stamp out human rights violations in global supply chains will help ensure that those who most need to benefit from international trade and foreign investment now are receiving their fair share. On our side, the UK currently holds more foreign investment stock than any other EU member state, and communities up and down the country have benefited enormously over the years from the jobs and prosperity that such investment can bring. And we're committed to developing capital investment schemes to encourage further such investment, especially into target areas identified by our industrial strategy. The UK is ranked 7th out of 190 countries in the 2017 Ease of Doing Business rankings, and we will safeguard the UK as an attractive investment environment into the future. More than this, the UK boasts a higher score than any other European country in the index that measures quality of judicial process. This underlines the confidence that foreign investors can have in our judicial system. It also supports our opposition to any form of investor-state dispute settlement mechanism over and above those domestic courts that we all rely on. As concluded in the official cost-benefit analysis commissioned by the government themselves into the prospects of extending ISDS rights to North American investors, there are no benefits to be gained from such a move, only costs. There are so many aspects of international trade and investment that I've been unable to touch on in this short time, and I hope anyway, that we've got time in the Q&A session in just a moment. Let me conclude with some final thoughts. With all the upheaval created by Brexit and the anxiety of a world riven with seemingly intractable conflicts, we need a new model of trade and investment that can restore people's faith in the power of international relations to do good. That's why a Labour government will match our ambition to open up new markets overseas with a commitment to make trade and investment work in the interests of all people, enhancing rights at work, life opportunities, and social standards not just in Britain, but across the world with our trading partners. As the Labour Party pioneers sought to do over 100 years ago, we will use international trade to build bridges between people, to break down walls. We will seek to negotiate new agreements with our trading partners based on the principles of mutual respect and cooperation, and with public interest at their heart. A Labour government will ensure that future trade agreements are cast in a new mould that is fit for the challenges of the 21st century, and we will rebuild confidence in the ability of trade negotiators to serve the wider public good. In the Labour Party, we are steadfast in our belief that when correctly designed and properly managed, international trade and foreign investment are and should be of huge benefit to the many and not the few. You'd expect me to get that in, wouldn't you? For this to become a reality, we need a change of direction. This election offers the people of Britain the opportunity to make that change. Thank you very much.